A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Rakak Wadash, double honors to the apostles and elders, great millstone, for teaching us the truth and citations to the sincere Akim and Aquathi will listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will, as always, an edifying lesson. And for today's topic, I wanted to add my 2 cents in regards to a topic that was done by, our apostle Elder Orion Lob, in regards to touched upon some talking points in regards to the college education, and basically, a lot of our people, by this guy, he was reacting to pushing our people to essentially acquire a college education, right? I'll throw university in there as well. You know what I mean? So, I wanted to add my 2 cents on it, speaking from experience. And, basically, it's essentially, it's a waste of time. It's not something that's very, very profitable, for you. And, and I kind of want to touch on a couple talking points too, because there's a talking point, the apostle mentioned in regards to the funding that comes from, these different schools, right? And, and where it comes from, right? Following the money, right? So I wanted to hit a couple talking points, and, Lord's will is always, this lesson will be edifying, right? So, this is my 2 cents, pretty much, on, that school system, because there's a few things I wanted to touch and discuss, because it doesn't touch on a lot of these topics here, so one of the first things it doesn't discuss when you go into those school systems, it doesn't discuss prophecies. It doesn't discuss, what happened to you as a people. It doesn't discuss the why you're in the condition that you're in. Even if you actually went into a more specialized study, they have specialized studies like, so-called African American studies, right? You're not gonna get the full understanding in regards to those, your condition as a whole, right? You basically you're wasting your time, and on top of that, it's not like it's a cheap investment. It's a kind of investment where you have to spend, lots and lots of money, and basically it leaves you, in a lot of debt, right? But, in the minds of our people, it's seen as essentially as an accomplishment too, because when you look at certain shows, that popularized that understanding of, going to a college, and, there was a certain aura of prestige it offered, and that trickles down into a lot of you tribes, especially, in the Caribbean islands. You either went into sports, or, you excelled in, education, right? But, it's a lot of money, especially in a time where with AI on the rise, it's basically AI is basically doing the job a lot more efficiently, than, having human workers. And that's something that a lot of these companies are coming to realize, right? So, understanding and discerning, like, okay, this is not something that's very profitable for you, right? So I want to start off with this first, these two precepts here, and I wanted to read something in regards to the funding, right? Because they teach you what they want to teach you, right? So this is Isaiah chapter 34, verse 16, because a lot of our people, go to college, to acquire, an education, acquire, so-called, better life, and so on and so forth, right? Trying to raise their socioeconomic status, because they understand on a carnal level, they don't have the status as in comparison to the other nations. So, for example, the so-called, Chinese, the so-called, Ish people, so-called white people, they understand that they're bottom of the barrel, basically, right? But if in your prophecy, you would know that, you know that the other nations, they will be the head, and you would be the tail, right? So going back here in Isaiah, this is Isaiah chapter 34, verse 16, and it says here, "Seek ye out of the book of the Lord and read. None of these shall fail, none shall want her mate. For my mouth it hath commanded, and his spirit it hath gathered them." So, seeking out of the book of the Lord, the Bible, and read, and understand that, there's prophecies contained within the scriptures. And that's what separates the knowledge of this world and the knowledge of all these other religions with the Bible, because it's a book, it cannot be compared to the knowledge of all these other so-called religions or whatever, and all these different textbooks. That's another thing too, that they a lot of these programs in school, it's a penny. It costs a lot. It really does cost a lot. It adds up. It's not just the tuition itself. You have to deal with textbooks, you have to deal with transportation, you have to deal with parking, you have to deal with food costs. If you're staying on campus, it's residence, and all these costs add up, right? And if you understood, in our condition as a people, you understand that, okay, this, the prophecies, we understand that, our condition, is a spiritual condition. And that's another talking point, I wanted to hit, as well. And going back into the prophecies, there was a certain amount of curses that were placed on us, as a people. That's information you're not going to get in college. You won't get that type of understanding in college, and then there's something else I was looking up recently, just to show you the power of the Bible. You had this guy named what's his name? Christopher Columbus. He actually had a Hebrew interpreter, with him, when he made his voyage to come on this side of the world, because he had an understanding of, he read the book of Ezra, right? That's found in the book of Ezra, about the different, the tribes, and they went into a land, and it was called Arsareth, to roughly paraphrase. All those are prophecies that played out. So a lot of these different historians, they do their digging, they do their diligent search to be able to search out certain things, and they realize that, the Bible stands the testament of time. Basically, it stands up, right? And that's information you won't get in college, because if I'm being honest, that's something I've never. When I heard that, I was like, wow, I never ever heard that before. All this time you hear about Christopher Columbus, but you never really learned where he got that information from, and a lot of it goes back to the Bible, right? So, just to show you that the comparison and the value of the education, of a biblical education versus a so-called college education, right? That's the first point I wanted to hit. So where I'll go next, because I did discuss the point on the costs and all that kind of stuff, right? All these costs, add up, and our people are already at a disadvantaged state, because they're already not, they're poor, right? They're poor financially, and they're also poor spiritually, right? So this is Isaiah chapter 55, verse 1, and it says here, "Ho, everyone that thirsteth, excuse me, come ye to the waters, and he that hath no money, come ye, buy and eat. Yea, come and buy wine and milk without money and without price. Wherefore," verse 2, "wherefore do ye spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor which satisfieth not," right? So why do you go into these institutions and they don't actually satiate you? You're our people, they go into these things, and they think that acquiring a so-called college education is going to satiate their spiritual hunger. It doesn't work that way, because you're really lacking a relationship with the Lord. You've departed from your creator, from your maker, right? And it says here, continuing on, it says, hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye which is good. So eat, and devour, understanding, devour proper instructions. And where do you get that sort of instructions from? You get it from the scriptures. You get it from the Lord's prophets. The scriptures say that, wisdom, she uttereth her voice in the streets, and she crieth in the chief place of concourse. That's really where you're going to get true wisdom and true living, true understanding, in regards to, your condition, first of all, as a whole, and the understanding of repentance. We're in this position where we transgressed against the Lord, and then, here is the way, this is the way, walking in it, walk back this way. You were walking incorrectly, all this time, right? And college is an incorrect way of essentially walking, right? It doesn't actually, guide you as an Israelite of how to actually navigate, you know and then on top of that, there is the lifestyle that it promotes too. Heavy drinking, heavy revelry, heavy unclean sexual behaviors, and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying? It's a lifestyle that doesn't actually, it completely like contrasts, the scriptures, right? I'll read verse 3 as well. And it says here, incline your ear and come unto me and hear, and your soul shall live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, even the sure mercies of David, right? And that's very important too. When you know about, King David and his history, know about the ways of your forefathers. Scriptures say that to inquire the ways of your forefathers, and that type of understanding you're not gonna get, in college. You're gonna get that by the Lord putting his servants and revealing those secrets unto you, via his servants, the prophets. You know what I'm saying? That's why they're there. They're leading you. We're essentially a fatherless generation, and the spiritual fathers, the prophets, play the role of spiritual fathers, guiding you back, to the Lord. That was the purpose of prophets. You know what I'm saying? One of the purposes as well, I should say. I want to read this in Ezra. 1 second. Give me 1 second. Because you're not going to get that kind of understanding in when it comes to your spiritual condition and giving you spiritual understanding. You're not going to get that in college. Let's just be real. Right? So this is 2nd Ezra chapter 1 verse 39. And it says, unto whom I will give for leaders Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Oseas, Amos, and Micah, Joel, Abdias, and Jonas, and Nahum, and Abakuk, and Zephaniah, and that's supposed to be Agai, and Zachary, Zechariah, Malachi, which is called also an angel of the Lord. So the Lord gave us these particular leaders within our history to be able to, properly guide us as a people. And the same thing is that same mindset applies, today. You know what I'm saying? The same mindset applies today with our apostles and elders, guiding us, back to the Lord, right? So, we can actually, essentially, like I read earlier, to receive that mercy as well, because our people go into these institutions and not realize, we're in debt. You know what I'm saying? We transgressed, and then you're in an environment that causes you to transgress, even more, right? So, okay, so let me read this here, because the apostle did mention, briefly, and this talking point about funding and where a lot of this funding comes from. So this is This is one of my books here. It's called Trillion Dollar Conspiracy by Jim Mars. You can buy it. Take a read. It's really really good. You know, and this is what pretty much was one of the reasons that inspired this topic lesson anyway. Um, because they teach you what they want to teach you, right? So I want to read this here. This is page 197. And it says, workers, not thinkers. It says, serious attention to education as a means of social control began in Europe, and with the same minds whose philosophies led to the communist and Nazi totalitarianism. It says, education, this is one of their quotes. It says education should aim at destroying free will so that after pupils thus schooled they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise as their schoolmasters would have wished, right? So this was basically the mindset of what they wanted to do when they thought about education. It's the same mindset that applies now, right? Because they want you to learn, what they want you to learn. You know, if it's outside the realm of their understanding, because the scriptures talk about how the wisdom of this world is foolish, because they think of themselves as the wise, right? Esau thinks of himself as, the wise. You know what I'm saying? But when you understand righteousness, and when you understand a spirit, when you have a spiritual aspect and could make spiritual comparisons, you realize you're outside of the realm of his so-called base understanding, right? So, um, I want to read this real quick, because this is very interesting. It mentions this as well. It says one of the major influences. It says Hegel, which was most noted for his Hegelian dialectic. It says thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, also known as a problem reaction solution. The globalists, however, have bastardized Hegel's mere philosophical diagram of human interaction. Rather than wait for a problem to deal with, they create the problem, then offer a draconian solution. They compromise, and after compromise and negotiation, they have advanced their agenda without opposition, realizing their design, right? So if when you understand, going back to the point about biblical education, when you understand who you are and you know about your ways of your forefathers, you know about your enemies, Psalms 83, you understand, the type of Esau person, the type of person Esau is, you learn to essentially be more skillful as a spiritual fighter, basically, right? So you understand this is the way Esau does things. So when you look at certain calamities that are, you know, using what happened a couple years ago as an example, you look at that and you think, okay, Esau's using this to try and acquire more control. You know what I'm saying? So they push out these different draconian measures, right? So they used the syringe a couple of years ago to be able to make you people much sicker, right? To get rid and thin the herd. If I want to say it very politely, right? So, the scriptures say also we are not ignorant of Satan's devices, right? So you know how Esau thinks, you know how he operates, because Esau is very well studied. It's only our people that are not very well studied when it comes to the nature of the heathens and the nature of understanding how they function and stuff like that, right? Okay, let me go to the point. I wanted to read that real quick. Okay, so here's really the juicy point. It says the oil magnate John D. Rockefeller Sr., whose dominant oil empire was founded by the Rothschild-controlled National Bank of Cleveland, created, the General Education Board in 1903 to dispense Rockefeller donations to education. So keep that in mind. It says by 1960, it had ceased operating as a separate entity and its programs rolled into the Rockefeller Foundation. It says by the 1970, the board made a $6 million grant to Columbia University, this News Lincoln School, a private experimental co-educational school in New York City. According to school literature, the facility's predecessor was founded by the Lincoln School in 1917 by the Rockefeller founded General Education Board as a pioneer experimental for new educational methods under the aegis of Columbia's University's Teachers College. So basically, there were certain schools that were funded by the this General Education Board, which was a creation, of the elites, right? So I want to read a little bit more down here, and then I'll go back to my main, talking points here. And it says here, the institution of higher learning, long founded by the Rockefellers, is in the University of Chicago's, and closely connected to it is the English world's most accepted authority on everything, the Encyclopedia Britannica, Inc. in 1940. Sorry, in 1943, it says an advertising executive William Benton purchased an encyclopedia and operated it as a charity for the University of Chicago. So a lot of these different schools, basically, simply put, were funded by this general education, board. They receive a lot of money, and they basically they teach you what they want to teach you. They don't teach you the ins and outs of what's going on. They don't teach you they teach you basically how to just be a worker within society. They don't actually teach you how to actually question things, how to examine things. You know what I'm saying? And this is part of just knowing who you are and knowing, your enemy, right? So, and the scriptures. Hold on, let me get this in a Baruch. I didn't have this on the talking point. Just bear with me 1 second. This is Baruch chapter 4, verse 1, and it says, "This is the book of the commandments of the Most High, and the law that endureth forever, and all they that keep it shall come to life, but such as leave it shall die." It says, "Turn thee," and our people are spiritually dead. That's the thing, because college doesn't add to it doesn't actually bring you back to life, in a in a spiritual sense. This is verse 2, and it says, "Turn thee, O Jacob, and take hold of it, and walk in the presence of the light thereof, that thou mayest be illuminated." So be illuminated in regards to, your history, knowing who you are, knowing what's going on. And that's a big thing too, because we're still living in a time of prophecies, and there's a bubbling up of certain calamities, of the third woe, the third world war, their MOTB system, and so on and so forth. All these things are being stirred up, right? That's why I started off with that first precept, because it says none of these shall fail. None of those prophecies, all those prophecies that are written in the book, are coming and will come to pass, right? So, I guess I'll make one more point because I don't want to make the lesson too long, but I might do a part two, And the second point, I kind of just wanted to add is that, when you go into college and those, educational, school systems, what you learn a lot of pseudoscience. You learn a lot of things, philosophies that basically contrast the ways of the Lord, right? And you learn a lot about, things that are actually cause and actually bring forth death. They don't actually learn things that are actually going to bring forth, life, whether it's how their approach to health, their understanding, their watered down understanding of history. They're not giving you the full, they're not giving you the full meat of what's going on, right? So I wanted to read this. Just bear with me on this. Let me just make this next point. Let me go to Genesis. So this is Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. And it says, "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also her husband with her, and he did eat." Right? So trees don't, fruits don't actually make people wise, right? So, this fruit, is referring to, like those philosophies that I spoke of earlier. Those philosophies that you learn, you know, in school, those abominable works, those odious works, are constantly being shown and being, pushed, within that environment. So you have, for example, you have feminism. That's a very big thing. You have an alphabet lifestyle. You have sodomy that gets pushed in those in those environments. Revelry, excessive, drinking. That is the type of culture that is strongly shown, within college. You have baby deletions. That's something that's very strongly encouraged. You know what I'm saying? And all these different lifestyles. When you go into our culture, when you understand your culture and you understand the ancient way, a lot of these lifestyles they contrast the scriptures. They actually just bring forth death. They don't actually bring forth life. And it's funny it mentions the woman, because like it's mostly when you really take a step back, ever since the demic situation back in 2022, right? Ever since those days, you had a lot of men dropping out, and you had a lot more women actually being more enrolled in schools, and a lot of our women are actually in those schools, playing the harlot, playing the field. It's mostly, and speaking from experience, it's, I was in class, and I had classes where the classes were probably about almost, I would say about minimum 60%, more 60 to 80% women. There were many of our classes that had a lot of men in some of those classes, right? A lot of those classes, and all these women, they like to study psychology, they like to study sociology and humanities, and they want to try and figure you out and so on and so forth and stuff like that, right? And a lot of it is to basically try, whether they know it or not, they're trying to circumvent, your authority, as a man. They're basically trying to essentially, they're trying to be, and trying to, basically, show themselves to see, to seem like they know more than you. So that makes a lot of these women prideful when you actually interact and you deal with them, because they would flaunt their education. That's where a lot of that stuff comes from, because they're one sex that's mostly enrolled. Especially our women are heavily, especially so-called black women, heavily enrolled in different schools, right? So, I wanted to read that because it really shows you our women are very strongly seduced by that lifestyle, and then they don't understand the programming. They don't understand that, they've been bamboozled to think that they don't even need a man, and they're constantly being shown, okay, go to school, go get your education, go get your bag, and meanwhile your family is destroyed, right? You're also furthering the destruction of your own I don't want to say community, but your own nation, so to speak, right? And a fruit, it represents works, it represents philosophies. Let me get this here. Matthew 7. Okay. This is Matthew 7 and 17. It says, "Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit, and a good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit," right? So, when you go into that word fruit, the Greek word there is karpos, which means works, deeds, behaviors, right? These different customs of the heathen. And Jeremiah said this as well, don't learn the ways of the heathen. Our people get seduced into these different lifestyles, and it makes you more of essentially a degenerate plant of a strange vine rather than being a noble vine of how we're actually created and we're supposed to be, right? So those different works that's very strongly encouraged, sexual liberation, those different works don't actually bring forth life, when it comes to us, as a nation, us as a culture. We have our own, culture, and we're supposed to really and truly supposed to be separate, right? So, you know, um, I guess I'll stop right here, but I end off with this last one here. Let me go to Sirach. And just to kind of tie everything back together, just bear with me. My laptop's a bit slow. Um, this is Sirach 19, verse 22, and it says, "The knowledge of wickedness is not wisdom, neither at any time the counsel of sinners prudence," right? So, the knowledge of wickedness is not wisdom, because there is no fear. And that's one of the first things you learn, when you actually being trained up properly in this understanding of the truth is, you learn to actually fear the Lord, and that produces conduct, that produces uprightness of how we're actually supposed to be, and you acquire a lot of knowledge in this, in these schools, and it doesn't actually teach you how to actually, it doesn't teach you how to fear the Lord. Let's just keep it at that. And that's information that you only will get from the Lord's secret, Lord's servants, the prophets, right? So, anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but hopefully, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.